I'm going to get wasted for the first time at 90.
It'll be a birthday month. Maybe 90, though. We should go big. Do a birthday year.
Yeah. That's my signature move.
That's why I don't even try.
I've got a real-life party trick. He's right here.
Scott's favourite party trick, he pulls out the sprinkler on the dance floor.
We don't do that at 90. That might scar people.
Oh, I think the party for turning 90 is going to be huge.
Happy birthday, ABC.
Yours for 90 years.
Good evening, it's Friday the 13th of April. Here are our top stories. A Chinese spy ship detected off Western Australia renews concerns over Beijing's military expansion in the region. Russia threatens retaliation against Finland over plans to join NATO. The ruler of the United Arab Emirates dies at the age of 73. And the first images released of a monster black hole in the Milky Way. You're watching The World. Hello, I'm Yvonne Yong. Also tonight, calls for more health investment in PNG as the Pacific nation struggles with the tuberculosis epidemic. A high-tech Chinese spy ship is making its way towards Darwin after navigating close to a secretive naval base on Australia's west coast. The federal government has described it as an aggressive act midway through the election campaign. And as Defence correspondent Andrew Green reports, the ship is staying just outside Australian territorial waters.
A boat Scott Morrison couldn't stop.
We're keeping a close eye on them.
In the height of an election campaign, this high-tech Chinese surveillance ship's arrived off the West Australian coast.
I think it is an aggressive act, and I think particularly because it has come so far south. For it to come south of Exmouth is without precedent.
According to Defence, the intelligence-gathering vessel crossed into Australia's exclusive economic zone last Friday. 2 days later, it came within 70 nautical miles of the secretive Harold E. Holt communications station at Exmouth. On Wednesday, it turned and began steaming north, this time coming within 50 nautical miles of the joint US-Australian naval installation. This morning, it passed the town of Broome and by Sunday is expected to approach Darwin.
A desperate campaign from a government that hasn't really campaigned on terribly much.
The People's Liberation Army Navy vessel is the same one which last year travelled to Australia's east coast to monitor the Talisman Sabre military exercises with the United States.
The Chinese push and push until they get some kind of pushback.
It's not unusual for spy ships to skirt outside Australia's territorial waters. It's been going on for decades. This country also conducts maritime surveillance. But China's timing for this mission during an election is provocative, and the government's eagerness to highlight it is telling. Earlier in the day, the topic of China loomed large in a televised campaign debate.
We have shown we will not bend to coercion.
An Albanese Labor government would not take a backward step.
With the Foreign Minister and her Labor counterpart agreeing, it's up to Beijing to fix the poor relationship with Australia. Andrew Green, ABC News, Canberra.
The President of the United Arab Emirates has died at the age of 73. Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan had ruled the Emirates since 2004 after his father and predecessor died, but several years ago he stopped being involved in day-to-day affairs, with his brother Abu Dhabi's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed seen as the de facto ruler. The UAE has announced a 40-day period of mourning and a 3-day suspension of work starting today. Russia has threatened retaliation after Finland announced it will formally apply to join NATO as soon as this weekend. Finland's historic shift away from neutrality comes amid a surge of public support for the move following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Europe correspondent Steve Kinane reports from Kiev.
Finland is a country that's prided itself on its neutrality.
Puhemies, ensinnäkin kiitos.
But that's about to change.
Unpredictable behavior of Russia is an imminent issue. Russia is more prepared to carry out operations.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine has propelled the Nordic country into seeking NATO membership, something it's been hesitant to do for fear of antagonising its eastern neighbour. But with no end in sight to Putin's aggression, Finland's leadership wants to join the alliance without delay.
When you ask if that would be the case that we join, well, my response would be that you caused this. Look at the mirror.
This historic policy shift has garnered increasing support in Finland.
I was not a supporter of the NATO membership before, but of course during the last months I have changed my opinion.
It's great news. It's about time.
And it's been welcomed here in Ukraine.
Absolutely right decision. That is showing that Putin is absolutely counterproductive. He was saying that the aim of this war is to stop enlargement of NATO. But NATO is enlarging.
Finland and Russia share a 1,300-kilometre border and a history of conflict. Fighting two wars between 1939 and 1944, Finland thwarted an attempted Russian invasion but lost around 10% of its territory.
The trust that existed between Finland and Russia has been, damaged badly.
Russia has threatened retaliatory action against Finland, but it's already got its hands full here in Ukraine. In recent days, it's been forced to withdraw troops from the villages around Kharkiv, and the battle for Donbass continues to be heavy going. Steve Kinane, ABC News, Kiev.
Sri Lanka's embattled president has appointed a new prime minister after his brother Mahinda Rajapaksa resigned from the position last week. But the former PM is facing more troubles after he and several other members of his party were banned from leaving the country for allegedly planning attacks against protesters. South Asia correspondent Avani Dias reports.
It's been a tumultuous week for the former Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, Mahinda Rajapaksa. On Monday, he stood down after months of protests, but now he has been banned from travelling overseas because he and 16 other MPs from his party are now being investigated for inciting violence. Now, the protests over the last few months over a deepening economic crisis that has cut off basic services for Sri Lankan people. Those protests have been largely peaceful, but on Monday, pro-Rajapaksa groups were bussed in from the countryside to the capital, where clashes went ahead. Now, more than 200 people were injured in those clashes. At least 8 people died. Now, a Sri Lankan court is investigating Mr. Rajapaksa and that group of MPs, alleging that they organised those clashes and the violence that occurred. Now, Mr. Rajapaksa is hiding out in a naval base on the south coast of Sri Lanka. He is in fear of being attacked. But while that is happening, his brother, the president of Sri Lanka, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, is refusing to stand down. He is trying to negotiate and keep the peace within his parliament. He has now appointed a new prime minister, a member of an opposition party, Ranil Wickremesinghe, and he's hoping that this new unity government will appease protesters, but they're continuing to galvanise, calling for him to resign as they continue to struggle without services every day.
North Korean state media is reporting its first COVID-19 related deaths just as the nation entered into a strict lockdown. 6 residents with fever-like symptoms have died. One of them is confirmed to have contracted the Omicron variant. It comes a day after leader Kim Jong-un appeared wearing a face mask for the first time on state television at a meeting to acknowledge the nation's first case. The country has remained tight-lipped about how many coronavirus cases they have, but Pyongyang has confirmed thousands of others have fallen ill following an explosive spread of fever across the nation. While the world's attention has been focused on COVID-19, the spread of another deadly disease has experts increasingly concerned. Australia's nearest neighbour, Papua New Guinea, is a global hotspot for tuberculosis, and there are now calls for increased investment to tackle the issue. Our PNG correspondent Natalie Whiting has more.
Outside the Gerahu Hospital in Port Moresby, dozens queue. Many are seeking testing and medication for tuberculosis. This clinic helps people from all over the city, but it's playing catch-up after the pandemic. Some TB patients were too scared to go to hospital, and COVID outbreaks forced some health facilities to close or limit access.
When the lockdown happens and the public transports are not moving, the patients are unable to get to the clinic.
PNG is a global hotspot for tuberculosis.
Increasingly, we're concerned about drug-resistant tuberculosis in PNG, so that is growing and it is quite concerning.
COVID-19 has reversed years of progress made in the fight to end TB.
Across the world, TB deaths have risen for the first time in 10 years.
Our trip is to initiate a TB preventative therapy, so we will be visiting 2 children below the age of 5.
Home visits in Port Moresby are proving effective.
Hi, morning. Morning.
Stephen Levy has TB and wants to ensure his family don't catch it.
I really appreciate the team coming over here to give us treatment, especially my 2 kids.
The family all sleep in this single room, increasing the chance of the disease spreading. Tuberculosis can be cured, but patients must take medication for months.
Most of the patients, they find it difficult for them to bring all their family to the hospital.
While the people here are getting help, the COVID-19 pandemic has severely impacted access to TB treatment for many in PNG. It's thought around 43,000 people fell ill with tuberculosis last year, but less than 30,000 said they had access to care. As the world adjusts to life with COVID, health workers are calling for other diseases to also get the attention and funding they deserve. Natalie Whiting, ABC News, Port Moresby.
Returning to news that Finland and Sweden are looking to join the US-led NATO alliance despite threats of retaliation from Russia. Natasha Lindstedt is a professor of government at the University of Essex and joins us now. Now, Natasha, Russia has warned it would have to take steps if Finland joined NATO. What would this entail?
Well, most security analysts are predicting that if Sweden and or Finland were to join, but let's just look at the case of Finland, that Russia could place tactical nuclear weapons on the Russian-Finnish border. And that's its main threat. Of course, it's been using economic weapons to the best of its ability, but we see the next step of escalation would probably be that, to send a very clear message that Russia, of course, is a nuclear power and that it's not afraid to use it, and that nothing is off the table.
So how serious is the threat, and do you think it'll deter Finland?
Well, with Russia, I feel you have to take everything it says and does pretty seriously, but we've seen that Russia has been faltering in the conflict. It hasn't been doing well except in the Donbass region. It's had to retreat in Kyiv and Kharkiv, and so it's not really at its strongest point. But the way Finland sees it is that in terms of dealing with Russia, you can't deal with Russia by appeasing it. In fact, its prime minister had said many times, we tried to appease Russia and nothing has really worked at this point. And so we want to increase our security, and that's only going to happen by joining NATO and by having that guarantee. Now, Finland is already part of NATO's Partnership for Peace, as is Sweden. And so the next steps for Finland, as they see it, is to become an official partner.
Is it any surprise that we're expecting Sweden to make its own announcement on pursuing NATO membership this weekend?
No, not at all. I think that Finland is further along in this. And in fact, if you look at public opinion surveys, 80% of people in Finland now do want to join NATO. Now, in Sweden's case, this was much lower, but it's increasing. You have now 57, 58% of Swedes are in agreement that they should also join NATO. And so public opinion has shifted tremendously in this regard because both countries had wanted to just be more neutral. They didn't want to cause any alarm with Russia and to entice the Russians to get more aggressive. But now they're seeing that really there's very little that they can do because the Russians have been incredibly aggressive in spite of the fact that the West has tried many, many times to appease it.
And will both countries be welcomed by NATO, and how long is the process expected to take?
Well, this process could take several months up to a year. Already we're seeing signals that most, if not all, the countries in NATO, with the exception of Hungary, are very welcoming of this. But the process takes a long time simply because they have to agree to what the requirements are and whether or not Finland and Sweden meet these requirements, these legal, military, and political requirements. Of course, they do. Then they would have to send an official letter that they intend to join. And then they'd have to ratify it. The NATO countries would have to ratify it. And there could be a lot of discussion here because Hungary could be the spoiler. They could decide that they want something out of this if they are going to agree to ratify these countries to join in, because Hungary is leaning towards Russia in different regards. So this could be several months or it could be up to a year. And I think a lot of that depends on Hungary.
And just finally, Vladimir Putin insists the Russian economy has successfully withstood the blow from Western sanctions. What's your assessment of this?
Well, in some ways, Russia has been able to get away with the fact that every single day, Europe gives Russia $800 million just to pay for different energy products, whether it be gas and oil or whatever. So it hasn't been completely isolated, and that's why it's been able to withstand a lot. But even before these comprehensive sanctions were implemented, Russia's economy wasn't able to grow. It was struggling. And then, of course, with the more recent sanctions, you saw the ruble plummet and then stabilize a little bit. But it's harder for Russian banks to operate, of course, and it's harder for the Russian economy to have any kind of movement, which is going to be incredibly important because they're waging a conflict and one that they're not doing particularly well on. So the game with sanctions is a long one. It takes a very long time for sanctions to really bite, particularly when you're dealing with such a big power that has so much access to different resources that they can sell to the international community. But it is chipping away at Russia's economy.
Natasha Lindstedt, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Protesters in the Philippines have flocked to the Election Commission Canvassing Centre in Manila, demanding an explanation for voting irregularities in the recent presidential elections. This poll saw the son of former dictator Ferdinand Marcos, known as Bongbong, win in a landslide, beating Vice President Leni Robredo.
31 million votes does not erase what happened during the dark years of martial law. It does not erase the crimes of the dictatorship.
Ferdinand Marcos Jr. will be sworn in on the 30th of June. 8 days from polling day, and Scott Morrison is vowing to change if he wins the election. The Prime Minister concedes he's been a bit of a bulldozer in public life, but says this side of his character was needed to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. But Labor leader Anthony Albanese says if voters truly want change, they need to change government. Here's Andrew Probyn.
Thank you for the birthday wishes. Friday the 13th, and the Prime Minister's birthday.
Very nice.
The man who's been asking Australians to vote for him, even if they don't like him.
I know Australians know that I can be a bit of a bulldozer.
Now promising to be a new Scott Morrison if he wins on May 21.
I know there are things that are going to have to change with the way I do things.
Don't look for Scott Morrison to change, because that's not going to happen. Just change the government.
Take me to the April sun in Cuba. The PM's attempt at a campaign reinvention coming after 2 years of pandemic governing.
That hasn't enabled Australians to see a lot of other gears in the way I work.
The best PM we've ever seen.
Echoing another Prime Minister's election trail reset.
I wanted to show even more of the real Julia Gillard, and I'm back.
Everything he does is desperate.
This is all for me.
He will just get more arrogant, more out of touch, less trustworthy.
Anthony Albanese in far north Queensland with a Great Barrier Reef announcement.
Hi. How you going?
A $200 million top-up to existing programs to prevent damaging runoff, reduce pollution and protect wildlife.
You're not going to miss one.
The PM in Melbourne.
I'll need some more time and training on this one.
With a plan to bolster critical supply chains amid concerned tension between China and Australia will continue to strain trade. Scott Morrison's hard line on Beijing, an as yet untested factor in electorates with big Chinese communities.
I draw a sharp and distinct line between the actions of an authoritarian government and the wonderful Chinese people.
If anyone suggests that Chinese Australians are not Australians, I think that is offensive, divisive, and un-Australian.
Scott Morrison told us a few weeks back the election wasn't a popularity contest, that even if Australians disliked him, they at least knew him, unlike Anthony Albanese. The PM's better the devil you know strategy, now a this devil will change if given a second chance. Labor's wanted all along for this election to be a referendum on Scott Morrison's character. They might have just got their wish.
Excuse me, who are you?
Supreme Leader.
Impersonators are everywhere, even at prime ministerial events.
Thank you very much.
Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
Thank you. Thank you.
Papua New Guinea's United Labour Party has vowed to continue the legacy of their leader and Deputy Prime Minister, Sam Basil, who died in a car crash on Wednesday night. Tributes are flowing in for the well-respected politician who was first elected as an MP back in 2007. His death comes as the country's readying to go to the polls. Journalist Scott Wade says Mr Basil leaves behind the legacy of a politician willing to go the extra mile for his electorate.
Firstly, he came into politics as a very young man in terms of PNG politics, because most of the people that were there were much, much older than him. So I guess he was fresh, straight as a businessman into politics, and people just weren't too sure what he was going to bring to the table. And when he started doing the work and when he started becoming influential, you know, people who were already there in politics started taking note. And he proved to be a force to be reckoned with. And that was the kind of person that Sam Basil was. He brought together people. He challenged obstacles that were, you know, seemingly impossible. He spent a fair deal of time in the opposition as part of a two-man opposition bench, himself and Belden Nama. So he never said, quite a difficult person to convince that there are obstacles in front of you.
How has news of his death been received in the community?
People have taken it pretty hard. In his village in Buang, where he lives there in his village and comes to town to work and then goes to Port Moresby, but always returns home. He spends a lot of time in the district, and he's, you know, a working politician. He's always on the ground, building roads, delivering medicines. You know, it's like he's a stereotypical, almost stereotypical PNG politician who is always in front delivering services. But, you know, I asked him once why he did that, and he said, you know, it's because the government system, the administration doesn't work, the bureaucracy doesn't work. That's why I had to do it myself. And people in his village have been, and generally in Morbe have been taking this news, very hard. Yesterday I was in front of his residence in Ley. People had already gathered at about 6, 7, 8 o'clock in the morning. There was another crowd at the funeral home where his body was being held. And there was I think there was a post-mortem that was carried out yesterday. I'm yet to confirm that. But the men, women, and children there crying with mud on their faces and all that. So it's yeah, they've taken it very hard.
What more do we know about the accident and what happened?
Details are sketchy at the moment. The person who was driving the other vehicle is alive and has been arrested for dangerous driving. Unfortunately, his name's come out, and people have, issued veiled threats here and there. So I've also advised people who have tried to put out the names of the driver, now just hold back. You're putting that person in danger. So he's been arrested by police. Police have released a statement on that arrest, and we don't know what's going to happen in the next few days, but an investigation is ongoing.
And Scott, there has been some uncertainty about whether this will delay the upcoming election. How might the timeline be affected?
1 week, 2 weeks at the most, but it won't be, it won't have as much of an impact. I think the concern was that if the government tried to rush it, or the Electoral Commission tried to rush it, people would see it as very disrespectful. So that's the narrative in the background, and also amongst Morabians and people in Bulolo. They're not too keen on seeing the nomination period rush through as Mr. Bassett is still in the funeral home.
Well, PNG elections involve incredible logistics in tallying votes across isolated and hard-to-reach villages. How are preparations going?
Yes, logistics is a big problem, and it always has been. And that was one of the things that made Sam Bassel stood out, because he actually walked all over his district. Wherever there was a road, whenever the road ended, he would get off the vehicle and walk. So he went to almost every village in his district. That's the challenge that the Electoral Commission is facing at every election. And to get ballot boxes to places where people can vote is a logistical nightmare, as always. There's a budget shortfall, and every election there's problems that people encounter.
Well, the last election 5 years ago failed to see a single woman voted into Parliament, despite there being many female candidates. Has there been any effort to address that this time?
There's a lot of discussion around getting more women into Parliament, but Papua New Guinea is still on a development path. I keep saying that we're trying to do everything as per the Westminster system requirements in a space of 50 years, half a century. So it's a difficult challenge to force this thing to happen. There are a lot more women who've put their hand up to run. It's very encouraging. Parties have stood up and said, we're going to endorse women. The women themselves have come out and said, we are going to run, and even if we lose, we're making a statement that the next election will come back.
What will voters be most concerned about when they eventually go to the polls? What are the main issues that are being debated?
It's the usual health, education, infrastructure, and increasingly it's the price of fuel for urban dwellers. In rural areas, it's a difficult place to be during elections, because people will still vote along tribal lines. So, yeah.
Scott Wide, thank you so much. Elon Musk says his $64 billion acquisition of Twitter is temporarily on hold. He tweeted the deal is pending more details on spam and fake accounts, which reportedly represent less than 5% of users. Shares of the social media company have tumbled 17% in pre-market trading. For the first time, scientists have captured an image of a massive black hole, which sits in the centre of our galaxy, the Milky Way. The international team of experts confirmed what they'd long surmised using a network of telescopes around the world.
Towards the constellation Sagittarius is Sagittarius A star, the supermassive black hole suspected to reside there. A source that has been a focus of intense astronomical studies for decades.
A black hole has a gravitational pull so strong that nothing can escape. Sag A star is 4 million times the mass of our Sun, and fortunately for us, it's 26,000 light years away from Earth. You're watching The World. The top stories we're following tonight. A Chinese spy ship has been detected off Western Australia, renewing concerns over Beijing's military expansion in the region. Russia threatens retaliation against Finland over plans to join NATO. The ruler of the United Arab Emirates, Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan, dies at the age of 73. 11 people have drowned after a vessel carrying an unknown number of Haitian migrants capsized off the coast of Puerto Rico. The boat sank 10 nautical miles off the coast of Desecho Island while attempting to reach US shores. 31 survivors have been found. 8 of them are undergoing treatment at a nearby hospital. Officials say they've seen a steady increase in migrants trying to reach US shores in unseaworthy vessels. Over the course of the pandemic, Australia has recorded more than 7,500 COVID deaths, with most of those happening over the past 4 months. But in the US, 1 million citizens have now died from the virus. Correspondent Barbara Miller has been speaking to affected families at a New Jersey memorial.
Families of some of the 1 million Americans who've died since the pandemic began gather to mark a grim milestone.
Who have you come here to remember?
My husband, Eric. He passed away in April of 2021.
3,000 people are remembered here.
It means so much. It gives us a place to come and honor not only my mom, but all the lives that were lost.
The memorial was created by Rima Saman in memory of her brother Rami.
The 1 million is just so tragic. I never thought that we would get to that point.
1 million COVID deaths, 1 million empty chairs around the family dinner table, each irreplaceable.
The dark days of 2020 are over, and vaccines mean many infections are now mild. But epidemiologists are warning against a false sense of security.
That the vaccine is not living up to our most optimistic hopes when it was unveiled. You know, we're not breaking these chains of transmission of COVID in the face of these new variants.
America is marking this grim milestone at a time when many COVID restrictions have been lifted. But don't talk to these people here about life returning to normal.
Like everyone else, we want this pandemic to be over, but you know, for us, it's always going to be a part of our lives.
Rima Saman says lessons should be learned.
I understand we want to move forward, but in order to move forward, we have to analyze what happened.
For so many Americans, simply moving on is not an option. Barbara Miller, ABC News, New Jersey.
The Northern Territory has a new leader after the shock resignation of Chief Minister Michael Gunner earlier this week. Natasha Fyles was sworn in as the Territory's 12th Chief Minister after emerging as a unanimous pick from the Labor caucus. It's the first time the Northern Territory has had a female Chief Minister and opposition leader at the same time.
I've had a front row seat to this job for 5.5 years, working closely with both Michael and Nicole. I know it's a tough job, but I'm pretty tough. I'm Territory tough.
Opposition leader Leah Finocchiaro says she's expecting weeks of instability from the government as Natasha Fyles picks her new cabinet. The fiancé of murdered columnist Jamal Khashoggi has condemned Australian golf great Greg Norman after he said we've all made mistakes in relation to the killing. The former world #1 golfer is leading a series of Saudi Arabia-funded tournaments in England and has come under criticism for his comments about Khashoggi's gruesome death. Hatice Cengiz says his comments are so hurtful. Queensland's disastrous summer of flooding is extending towards winter as unseasonal rain wreaks havoc in the state's south. Authorities say the situation is evolving and are pleading with everyone to heed warnings. Laura Lavelle reports.
another Queensland town in the path of disaster.
Last night, I kept feeling the carpet next to my bed, to see if there was water in my house.
Laidley's main street quickly engulfed.
It keeps inching up. We just don't know how far it'll go.
Some businesses are damaged just 10 weeks after the previous flood.
We have to start from square one again.
Local authorities surprised at how quickly the water rose.
Our crews are currently conducting a number of rescues on the far side of town.
This man was plucked from his car, saved from the swirling torrent. Another crew battled the tide, checking no one was trapped.
It is about the preservation of life. It's reminding people to not be complacent, to make really smart decisions.
Never go through floodwater because if you do, you might get stuck.
Children got the message, but some adults didn't. Further west,
it's the railway bridge at Grantham.
The town, deeply traumatised in 2011, was wrenched awake by an emergency siren.
You kind of jump out of bed because we're like, are we lapping in water?
The Godleys haven't recovered from February's flood. Their children have moved away.
Our daughter, she couldn't handle the trauma anymore. She's had 11 years of trauma.
Some Gatton residents are cut off.
A little bit of anxiety, I think, in general, across the community.
The region is also a food bowl and winter crops are waterlogged.
It's going to be affecting every farmer and every worker as well.
The rain was set to ease today, but forecasters believe that won't happen for another 24 hours. Local authorities fear falls like what we saw here in Laidley last night could be disastrous for the region.
This is very much an evolving situation, and we really want people to be across all of the warnings.
Further south, floodwater is expected to peak in Warwick tonight. Parts of the town are already under. While devastating for those in the firing line, the damage isn't expected to be as widespread as last time.
Please don't be anxious. The key thing is to be listening to the alerts.
This is a very unusual time of the year to have a severe weather event of this nature.
The timing is unusual, but the heartbreak is familiar. Laura Lavelle, ABC News, Laidley.
Returning to the first photo of the supermassive black hole at the centre of our galaxy. The monster abyss in the Milky Way is so powerful it took a network of telescopes around the world to capture. Astrophysicist Dr. Claire Kenyon says it's only the second supermassive black hole ever to be imaged.
So a black hole is basically a spot in space, an object that has just got so much mass, the same stuff that I've got and you've got that holds us to the Earth through gravity. It's got so much that beyond a certain limit, when light gets too close, even light, the fastest thing we know, can't escape. And that line is called the event horizon. The size of the black hole is basically the size of this event horizon. And so we've got a whole bunch of different types of black holes. We've got little ones the size of atoms called primordial black holes. We've got stellar mass black holes that are left over after stars go boom, supernovae. And then we've got these intermediate ones that we didn't even know existed until really recently. And then we've got these super massive black holes. Now, these guys, they're enormous. They're just colossal. They're huge. They're like, the mass of the sun, Yvonne, right? Yep. Times by 1 million.
Wow.
At their smallest. Yeah.
Wow,
so these ones can go between 1 million and 1 billion times the mass of the sun. Basically we think that they sit in the middle of pretty much all galaxies, our own included. And we think that they're related to how that galaxy grows and the dynamics inside that galaxy, even right to the start of the Big Bang.
So tell us a bit more about Sagittarius A. How did this name come about, firstly? How hard was it to find and how was the image even captured?
Yeah, so the name Sagittarius A star, first of all, it's not a star, it's definitely a supermassive black hole. And look, you've probably heard of the constellation or maybe even the star sign, Sagittarius. Well, about 50 years ago, scientists noticed lots and lots of strong radio emission coming out from this area in the sky that was actually within this constellation of Sagittarius. And they said, okay, well, what can we call it? Well, we'll call it Sagittarius A star. I know, we're very creative and inventive. And then later on, we actually got a lot better at technology. We got better techniques and we were able to actually zoom in on that little area quite a lot more to where this strong radio emission was coming out. and we go, oh, we think there's actually a supermassive black hole here. Oh, but we've already wasted Sagittarius A, so we're like, okay, well, we'll call it Sagittarius A star, so that we know that it's different from Sagittarius A, and we know that that's different from Sagittarius. So that's the name. That's where the name came from, everyone, which is kind of cute. And I don't think it really says good things about astronomers' creativity, but never mind. I'm sure we can improve.
I think you deserve more credit than you expect there. Now, this might sound like a silly question, but are we in any danger at all? Is it relatively close to us?
Not really. It's actually a long way away. It's about 27,000 light years away. So it's not coming for us at all. It's very, very, very happy just sitting there munching on the material that surrounds it and falls in. And actually, the reason that it was actually really hard to find, I don't know if you remember a little while ago, Yvonne, there was, I think in 2019, there was the first black hole ever imaged, right? And that was M87 star, and that is a long, long, long way away. But it was a bit easier to image because it's actually a lot bigger than our own supermassive black hole. The one in M87 star is about 6.5 billion times the mass of the sun. So Sagittarius A star is quite a bit smaller, but it's still supermassive. It's about 4 million times the mass of our sun. And you might be asking, well, it's black. It's a black hole. How on earth do we see something that is black? And you told me that light come out of it. So how do we see it? So what we're actually seeing is not the black hole itself, which is the center part. Of course, nothing gets out of there, but we see this sort of material that sits outside. So I was talking to you about how, if light goes beyond the event horizon, it falls in and it never comes out. Well, just outside the event horizon of pretty much all supermassive black holes and some stars as well is a sort of disk of material, of gas, of dust, of stars, and that kind of goes around and, loses momentum, loses energy and falls into the black hole and slowly adds to the mass of that black hole. And what's actually happened here with these scientists back with M87 in 2019 and also with Sagittarius A star is that you can't see this ring with, light or like normal visible light or anything. We have to go back right down to the low end of the spectrum, of the energy spectrum, called radio waves, which you probably are familiar with navigation and, GPS and all that sort of thing, and also communication. So they look in radio waves, and what they did is they used 8 different telescopes from around the world. They combine them in sort of a special mathematics which enables these 8 telescopes to act like one huge telescope. I think I've heard the comparison of it's like looking at a donut on the moon. So they looked at this supermassive black hole of 4 million times the mass of the sun, 27,000 light years away, by combining these 8 radio telescopes. And what we see is this wonderful disk of, it kind of looks like a ring. And so we're actually seeing that glowing material, this material that sits outside that black hole. It doesn't, go around in an orderly fashion. What it does is it bashes it, they kind of push into place, and there's lots and lots of friction which makes it glow, and that's where those radio waves come from, and that's what those telescopes have seen.
It is really quite stunning. Now, before we let you go, what other phenomena can we see in the sky over the coming nights?
This is fantastic. So there's actually a lunar eclipse, but unless you're in the Americas, Europe, French Polynesia, or the western half of Africa, you're going for a travel, Yvonne, you won't see it, unfortunately, not in Australia. Now, for the next few weeks until the end of the month, the end of May, you will, if you go out before dawn, just before dawn, maybe about 5:30, you'll see this beautiful line of planets. So if you look to the east, you'll see Venus very low on the horizon. Then going up on a line, you'll see Jupiter and Mars. And then about 2/3 of the way out from the horizon, you'll see Saturn. Now, if you watch this really carefully over, the next few days, and then towards the very end of the month, you'll notice that Jupiter's actually chased down and overtaken Mars in the sky. And one more thing before towards the end of the month, if you're still not sure, whether you're actually successfully looking at a planet, I've got 3 dates for you. The 22nd, the 25th and the 27th, because the moon is going to show you the way. It will be visiting its solar system buddies. It's going to sit just above Saturn on the 22nd, and then just to the right of Jupiter and Mars on the 25th, and finally close to and just above Venus on the 27th. And I have been told this by a friend, I'm going to deliberately misquote this, the moon's got bros in different area codes.
Oh, fantastic. And I've taken note of those dates already. Thank you so much, Claire.
Fantastic.
Always good to talk.
Thank you, Yvonne.
A man charged in connection with a large drug haul in Newcastle has arrived in Sydney after being extradited from Queensland. Police have released CCTV images of two people they believe can help with their investigation into the death of a diver whose body was found near 50 kilograms of cocaine.
James Blea had taken a trip, but not to Singapore as the yacht captain had planned. He was arrested while allegedly trying to flee the country from Cairns Airport on Wednesday. The 62-year-old landed in Sydney late this afternoon after being extradited.
He'll be attending court tomorrow morning, charged with those very serious offences.
They include commercial drug importation and supply offences relating to $20 million worth of cocaine found near the body of a diver in Newcastle on Monday. It's believed the South American man drowned while trying to get the drugs from the hull of a cargo ship from Argentina.
I retrieved 50 kilos, but we're missing 50 kilos.
Police believe the man was left to die by unknown accomplices. They're now hunting a man and woman who they believe came to Australia illegally by boat.
It's likely these people were in the Newcastle area of New South Wales between the 1st and the 11th of May.
Detectives believe the original shipment weighed up to 300 kilograms and say cocaine dumped near Indonesia may be part of the haul.
We're reaching in both in Australia and across internationally to our partners internationally to ensure that everyone who is involved in this very serious offence, which is punishable by life imprisonment here in Australia, brings everyone involved in that offence to justice.
An attempt to shut down a drug operation spanning the globe. Rani Hayman, ABC News, Sydney.
An eyewitness has told a Sydney court Ben Roberts-Smith's ex-girlfriend had a large lump on her forehead from falling downstairs before the moment she alleges the war veteran punched her. Ben Roberts-Smith is suing 3 newspapers for defamation for reporting her allegation, along with accusations of war crimes and bullying.
It was after this function at Parliament House in 2018 that Ben Roberts-Smith is accused of punching his then-girlfriend. Codenamed Person 17, she claims he assaulted her in a Canberra hotel room, angry she may have exposed their affair at dinner. Today, the veteran's defamation trial heard from former Army Commissioned Officer Terry Nichols, who saw the woman at the end of the function trying to find Mr. Roberts-Smith. She was unsteady and she was quite slurred in her speech, Mr. Nichols said, recalling how he helped her. When she insisted on taking the stairs instead of a lift, she lost her balance and fell forward onto the stairs down to the bottom of the platform, landing with a terrible thud when she impacted on the stairs. They're quite solid. Mr. Nichols said when the woman regained consciousness, he noticed the immediate consequence. It was a large egg, half an egg, sort of on the forehead, he said, indicating the left temple. Person 17 previously told the court Mr. Roberts-Smith hit her in the same area as her injury from the fall, but not the same spot, resulting in a black eye. She claimed her memory of the night was fairly good and denied being so drunk she couldn't look after herself. Ben Roberts-Smith denies striking the woman. Last year, he told the court domestic violence is reprehensible. Jamie McKinnell, ABC News, Sydney.
The prestigious Archibald Prize has been awarded to Indigenous Sydney artist Black Douglas. It's the second time a First Nations artist has won the prize in its 101-year history.
Staring out across the gallery with a formidable scowl. This painting of Wiradjuri artist Carla Dickens by 5-time Archibald finalist Black Douglas has taken out Australia's top portrait prize.
It's just really made me feel the love to be able to be here proudly representing and saying that, yes, we did it. And it was, it kind of feels like winning an election campaign, really.
The larger-than-life work speaks to the horrors of flooding on the state's north coast. The leaky buckets, a stab at the art industry, taking commissions away from artists.
The leaking buckets is 50% of your earnings going out the bottom there.
Black is a cheeky artist, and we're going to get much more of it as he speaks over the coming weeks and months. That's another great thing about the Archibald. It's a platform for artists to not just to show their work, but to talk to the community.
There were more than 800 entries in this year's Archibald Prize, and a total of 52 artists were chosen to be hung on the gallery walls. Jude Ray's depiction of inventor Saul Griffith was highly commended by the judging panel. Nicholas Harding's leafy Eora took out the Wynne Prize this year, and this Japanese folk design, made with a kite and part of a helicopter shell, was the winner of the Sulman. Ruby Cornish, ABC News, Sydney.
Australia's through to this weekend's Eurovision Song Contest final in Turin, Italy. 23-year-old Sheldon Riley booked his place in the top 25 with Not the Same, a song he co-wrote about growing up with Asperger's syndrome.
I'm not the same, no.
I'm so grateful that I get to stand here and do what I get to do in front of countries that may or may not understand or respect what I do, but at the end of the day, they look at me with a place of love, and it means the world. It really does.
Sentimental favourites Ukraine also made it through to the final, which will be held Sunday morning, Australia time. An increasing number of regional footy and netball clubs in Victoria are struggling for numbers as they emerge from the pandemic. That's making it hard to win games, but some clubs are hoping guest appearances from some former AFL players will help them rise again, as Michaela Ortolan reports.
It's Thursday night and the Longwood Football Club is on the training track. But it's been tough going in recent years for the Redlegs. It hasn't won a game since 2019.
We beat Ardmona by about 3 goals, I think. It's been a long time between drinks.
The club struggled to recruit and retain players as it's emerged from the impacts of COVID.
Here you don't have the depth to fill those spots. It's hard enough filling 1 or 2, but when you've got to fill 13 of them, it just nearly becomes insurmountable.
It's a similar story for the North Wangaratta Hawks. Their home game against Bonnie Doon isn't going to plan. It was without a home ground for 3 years after the soil was found to be contaminated with lead poisoning from a neighbouring gun club in 2016.
We lost about 30 players over that period due to just not having a home facility, and just guys wanted a real home base, and not having that, it was hard.
And they're not alone. Across the state, players haven't returned from the pandemic lockdowns. Some clubs have folded, with women's football hit particularly hard. But there is some immediate help on the horizon for Longwood and North Wang. A beer company promotion will see 8 former legends play one-off games for struggling clubs across the state. Geelong Premiership player Cam Mooney will be a Redleg for a day.
It's just great for exposure and have people talking about your club and people coming down to take some interest in your club.
While St Kilda and Essendon star Brendan Goddard will pull on the brown and gold.
Hopefully, get a few thousand through the gate and we might be able to steal some players next year.
It's the shortest of loans, but the clubs hope it will provide a long-term payoff. Michaela Ortolan, ABC News.
Australia has won the right to host the 2027 Men's Rugby World Cup and 2029 Women's World Cup. It's the first time that Australia will host the women's event and the first for the men since 2003. Organisers hope it sparks a revival for rugby here. Here's sport reporter David Mark.
They're calling it a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Kids, boys, girls who are at school or thinking about playing rugby or just wanting to represent their country. What an amazing opportunity to do that.
We've got a huge opportunity. There's been some negativity around our game in Australia for a while, but that stops right here.
It's 19 years since the last Rugby World Cup was held in Australia, when Johnny Wilkinson broke the Wallabies' hearts in the final.
Here it is for Johnny. Has he done it? He sure has!
George Gregan was captain of that Wallabies side, the last of a golden generation, and he acknowledges the game has slipped over the past 2 decades in terms of popularity and results.
It's a high-level sport. It does come down to performance, and there's just been a bit of inconsistency over a period of time.
The hope is the World Cup will not only attract billions of dollars, but also act as a lure in a crowded sporting market.
We want to get more boys and girls and men and women playing the game.
No doubt it's a competitive market in the women's game at the moment, but what more as an Australian athlete would you want to do than play at a World Cup on home soil and have the green and gold crowd cheering for you?
People love the game of rugby. You go around the community, there's lots of rugby supporters, but you just need to get them there consistently, and I think that's the challenge. But this is also the opportunity that this lies ahead.
The World Cups add to what will be a very busy decade for Australian sport. This year, Australia hosts the Basketball Women's World Cup. Next year, it's the Football World Cup. Then there's the 2 Rugby World Cups, and in 2032, the jewel in the crown, the Summer Olympics.
There's plenty to look forward to. David Mark, ABC News, Sydney.
Lang Park's hosting 8 NRL matches this weekend as the Magic Round goes ahead despite torrential rain forecasts. Around 50,000 fans per day are expected to walk through the gates, with all 16 clubs playing. Enthusiastic punters braved the wild weather for the Bulldogs Knights and Sea Eagles Broncos doubleheader tonight.
Got to be a proud supporter. Come down.
Rain, hail, or shine, we're going to come.
Doesn't make a difference. No. Broncos, Grandmas, Cowboys. We're all the way from Sydney.
Saturday's triple header is a sellout. The round finishes with a clash between the Tigers and Cowboys on Sunday. Time for a check of the weather. Here's Paul Higgins.
We have rain in the west and rain in the east. It's all coming from moisture streaming in from the tropics, but lots of blue sky in between. Tomorrow, more rain in southeast Queensland, easing to showers. Rain in southern New South Wales will drift down to northeastern Victoria. A trough crossing Tasmania will bring some showers, and a cold front clipping the southwest will bring some showers there. Perth will have an afternoon shower or two. Windy in Adelaide with the chance of a shower. Hobart will have morning showers, and Canberra showers in the afternoon. In Melbourne, a shower or two. A warm day in Sydney, but partly cloudy, and another 15 to 30 millimetres of rain for Brisbane, partly cloudy in Darwin.
Before we go recapping our top stories, a Chinese spy ship has been detected off Western Australia, renewing concerns over Beijing's military expansion in the region. Russia threatens retaliation against Finland over plans to join NATO, and the ruler of the United Arab Emirates, Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan, dies at the age of 73. And that's your world for this Friday evening. You can always catch the show on iView, and more world news and interviews can be found on the ABC's YouTube channel. I'm Yvonne Yong. Have a great weekend.
Next week on 7:30, as Australians get set to deliver a verdict, Prime Minister Scott Morrison...
You know, as Prime Minister, you've got to take all the slings and arrows, and I do.
...and Opposition Leader Anthony Albanese...
Australians deserve a government that looks to the future.
...go head-to-head with Lee Sales in their most important interviews of this make-or-break campaign.
Anthony Albanese, thanks very much for being with us. Prime Minister, thanks for your time this evening.
7:30, next week, ABC TV and ABC iView.
It's the daily destination for everything election.
It's about Australians and the decisions they're making.
We go beyond the campaign trail.
Good to be out and about.
And speak with all the key players.
You don't believe your own government's commitment.
Yep. If it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck.
Plus, expert analysis on the seats that could decide the result.
For the latest in your electorate and around the country.
Greg, plenty to
talk about.
Join Greg Jennett and Fran Kelly for afternoon briefing. Weekdays at 4 on ABC News and ABC iView. She's the woman who inspired a political movement.
She was there to stand for something different.
Kathy's the godmother of the independent movement.
On the road with Kathy McGowan.
These teal independents are posing as a real game changer in Australian politics.
It's going to be fierce. They're fighting for cattle stations. They don't want to give up these safe seats.
Independents in a hung parliament actually undermine the government that the majority of Australians elected.
She looks like your mum, but she's very formidable.
On Australian Story, Monday at 8 on ABC TV.
He's more dangerous than he's ever been in the last 22 years.
Red alert.
Putin the Great is what he wants to be.
Vladimir Putin's road to war.
To lie is what he was taught.
This was not the war of the Russian people. This is Vladimir Putin's war.
The question everyone is asking is, what do we do about Vladimir Putin?
He will not be humiliated, and that makes him also much more dangerous.
Four Corners, Monday, ABC TV and ABC iView.
It's such a scary thing, feeling like you're not in control of your mind. I would put myself in the fetal position. It was terrifying.
In a unique social experiment, 7 strangers will expose their deepest fears.
It takes a lot to come out and talk about mental health.
Can art and creativity heal invisible wounds?
Whoa.
Hosted by Natalie Bassingthwaite. With some of Australia's best-known artists.
All will be revealed.
Space 22 starts Tuesday on ABC TV and ABC iView. Gruen Nation is back.
Separating the ScoMos from the elbows, you can call me Ando, but not Undo.
Cut cutting through the clutter of election advertising.
To prove he won't be a PM that turns everything into a photo shoot, Albo's appeared in a series of photo shoots. If he loses the election, Tarakash just found their next model.
Ruin Nation.
Oh, I know what I'm voting for in the hottest 100!
Wednesday at 8 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
The Lost Children of Saudi.
Le había dicho a mi mamá que iba a regresar y nunca regresó, entonces...
Every child is entitled to a mother and a father.
And the fathers who abandoned them.
I had that overwhelming urge and drive to find him.
Searching for answers.
He said when he saw me that I look exactly like him. I understand a lot more in detail the culture of his family and the sheer terror that my father must have felt.
Foreign Correspondent, Thursday at 8 on ABC and ABC iView.
I know guys in Australia who make customized wetsuits and surf trunks.
We got to stop running the business out the back of my van. It's not sustainable. I've sustained you so far.
Hey, maybe you'll become a millionaire. Isn't that the dream?
Wait, this isn't what I came for.
Show them who you really are.
Barron's. Log in to ABC iView to stream the series.
Hello, Von Yong with the top stories on ABC News. 8 days from polling day and Scott Morrison's vowing to change if he wins the election. The Prime Minister concedes he's been a bit of a bulldozer in public life, but says this side of his character was needed to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic. Labor leader Anthony Albanese says if voters truly want change, they need to change government. Meanwhile, a high-tech Chinese spy ship is making its way towards Darwin after navigating close to a secretive naval base on Australia's west coast. The vessel is staying just outside Australia's territorial waters. The Morrison government is describing the mid-election visit as an aggressive act. Russia has threatened retaliation after its neighbour Finland announced it would formally apply to join NATO. The historic shift away from neutrality comes amid a surge of public support for joining due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the prestigious Archibald Prize has been awarded to Indigenous Sydney artist Black Douglas for his portrait of Wiradjuri artist Carla Dickens. It's the 5th time the self-taught painter has been an Archibald finalist, but just the 2nd time in the prize's 101-year history that a First Nations artist has won. Those are the latest stories. I'm Yvonne Yong.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers are advised that the following program contains images and voices of people who have died.
Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Catherine Robinson. Coming up, a week out from the election and revelations that a high-tech Chinese surveillance ship has been spotted off the coast of Western Australia. New analysis finds most women standing for the two major parties this election are in unwinnable seats. And artist Black Douglas takes out the prestigious Archibald Prize, becoming the 2nd Indigenous winner in 101 years. Joining me on the panel, Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Social Justice and Inclusion at the University of Technology, Sydney, and former New South Wales Labor MP, Verity Firth. Great to see you, Verity.
Good to see you.
In Melbourne, barrister, City of Melbourne councillor and Liberal Party member, Rashina Campbell. Great to meet you, Rashina, and welcome to The Drum.
Thanks for having me.
Disability advocate and former Green staffer, Sam Drummond. Great to see you, Sam.
Thanks for having me.
And foreign editor at The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Always looking forward to speaking with you, Greg.
Good to be with you, Kat.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag The Drum, and we're also on Facebook. Well, while much has been made of boosting women's participation in politics, new analysis from the ANU shows there may be some way to go, especially when it comes to running women in winnable seats. According to the study, both major parties are disproportionately running men in safe seats, while women are facing a so-called glass cliff in less secure electorates. When it comes to the major parties, women make up 43% of Labor candidates and 29% of coalition candidates. Of Labor's female candidates, just 24% are in winnable seats, compared to 33% of Labor's male candidates. 20% of the coalition's female candidates are in winnable seats, compared to 46% of men. The analysis considered a seat winnable if it was held by a margin of more than 6%. One of the study's authors says a myriad of factors are at play.
I think there's probably a number of things that are going on here. The metaphor of the glass cliff, that idea of glass means that it's relatively subtle. So it's not necessarily that someone's sitting there saying, OK, that's a terrible seat, we'll put a woman in there. The psychology behind it's probably a little bit more subtle. I think there is something around saving the safe seats for the boys. There's a bit of an old boys club there. So leaving probably the risky, the more precarious seats for women.
Well, Roshina, it seems right to start with you because you have a personal experience with this. You went for a Liberal Party pre-selection in the outer eastern seat of Casey and you were unsuccessful. You lost to a man by the name of Aaron Violi. What was that experience like for you?
It was a fantastic experience. We're really lucky in the Liberal Party that we still have grassroots democratic pre-selections where hundreds of members get to have their say. And I did lose to Aaron Violi, who was a local. And so that result is nothing to do with our respective sex. And during that pre-selection process, where I spoke to hundreds of members, not one of them said anything about not wanting to vote for a woman. But the other thing we've got to remember is these safe seats don't come up often. It's not uncommon for someone to be in the parliament for 20 years, perhaps longer. So it's always going to be a gradual process, that pre-selection process. But the thing that is so clear to me looking at those figures is that Labor's policy, which they've had in place now for years of quotas, has failed. The fact that a party that has a quotas policy has only 24% of their women in winnable seats says to me they're not serious about getting women into parliament. They're just happy to tick the box, and that's not good enough.
Well, if quotas don't matter, Roshina, how do you explain the stats that we outlined just earlier, that women account for 46.8% of Labor's seats in parliament? That was after the 2019 election, but only 25.9% for the coalition.
I come back to the point that it is a gradual process. When you've got MPs that stay there for 20 years, pre-selections don't happen often for those safe seats. But what we are seeing is that when those pre-selections open up, women are being pre-selected. So Victoria, where I'm in, Zoe McKenzie has been pre-selected to replace Greg Hunt as the candidate in Flinders, which is by any analysis a very safe seat. And then we've got Stephanie Asher, the Mayor of Geelong, running in Corangamite with a good show there, and Sian Coombs in Dunkley, another seat that we've got a good chance of winning. So these are all seats that are winnable by the ANU's analysis, and they're seats that women have managed to secure pre-selection in. So to me that says the trend in the Liberal Party without quotas is a good news story.
Verity, what do you make of those comments, particularly when you look at the idea, you know, there's one thing to say that you're promoting women and to have a quota of 50-50, but if you're putting them into precarious seats, does it really even matter?
Yeah. Well, I think that, look, it's really useful work to have come out of ANU, and I think we all need to be very wary and making sure that we're continuing to keep pressure on putting women into safe seats. But I do want to have a little bit of words with what Roshina was saying, which is if you actually look, so the figures that you were quoting were around the House of Representatives,
correct,
which, as you said, is still pretty good for Labor in terms of our current membership. It's about 46%.
Well, that 46.8 was the House of Reps and the Senate. It was 43% in the lower house for Labor.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, the figures that I looked at this afternoon, because I did pick it up, actually said when you include the Senate, Labor's now at 49.5% across the entire parliament.
Right.
But even if, 46, 49, the point is quotas have worked, right? So, in fact, our targets, or Labor's targets, are 50% by 2025. On those figures, we're at 49.5% by 2025. Now, I can tell you that quotas have worked because before quotas were introduced in the Labor Party, it was not like it was some sort of feminist paradise, right? The quotas were introduced in 1994. Roshina's right. It takes about 20 years to actually get action because it takes about 20 years for people to retire out of those safe seats and to move people in. It is virtually impossible, I would argue, particularly under the very typically patriarchal structures of traditional major parties to get any move unless you say, you know what, we're going to put some mechanism into the rules of this party that will have targets for women and will give women an advantage in pre-selections. It's the only way to do it.
I'm going to take issue with Verity's approach, which is I think there are many ways to achieve that outcome. And I think the fact that this time the ALP is running only 24% of women in winnable seats shows that perhaps quotas is not the most successful way. But there are other ways that the Liberals are looking at right now, including policies and programs to help women overcome the hurdles to pre-selection, getting comfortable with the process, getting ready to fundraise, understanding what you need to do on the polling booth. It's a skill that most people from outside of politics don't have. And by equipping women with it, they can get there on their merit. They're not quota girls, they're the best person for the job.
Sam, I can see that you're looking to jump in here. I mean, you've been a Green staffer. What did you observe in your time in that role? And do you think it's as much about, you know, local parties picking the members, or is it more about the Canberra culture?
Well, certainly, I think both our guests have made good points and good arguments about what we need to do to get more women in our parliament. But we can quibble over the statistics. The fact is that we're not at equality yet, with or without quotas. Now, you can talk about a generational change happening within the Liberal Party, but that's not happening. What I've seen in federal parliament and what we've seen in the last couple of years is that there are structural barriers, particularly within the Liberal Party, to more women participating in the process. Now, in the same vein, Labor has quotas and they're not at equality. So there's something there that's not working. And we need to be looking at what that is. We have a very adversarial system in our parliaments that is, by nature, it is adversarial. But there are things that we can do to change that. Now, you put aside things like sexual harassment and rape allegations that are not being properly addressed, that we've seen in the last couple of years. Putting aside that, you have a system where the very job description is to put the opinion of you and your constituents over. And since Julia Gillard onwards, we've seen that women are constantly shouted down for that. We have to do something to change that culture, because it's not working within the Liberal Party, and even with quotas, it's not working within the Labor Party. So we have to look very seriously. I was actually on a tram on the way here and had a chat to a woman in State Parliament, and she was talking to me about making sure that childcare arrangements are family friendly, looking at changing the hours of Parliament. These are very entrenched things within our system that we can look at and make it more accessible for women to get into.
And are they some of those structural issues that you were referring to?
Absolutely, and I don't think that we should stop the conversation at women. When we have more women in our parliament, it's more representative and they're more likely to make policy that is friendly for women. But we also know that the majority of parliamentarians went to private school. They're making funding decisions about school funding. The vast majority have never been on welfare. They're making decisions about where to cut welfare, not to how to make it the most efficient process and fair process for all. We don't have people making decisions about who gets to come into this country when the majority of them have never had to come into this country themselves and become a citizen. We have to make our parliament more representative so that the decisions are made for all of us, not for the few.
And can I just say, I think Sam is spot on about that. And my argument is, to get that sort of cultural change, you need critical mass, right? So absolutely right, you want a representative parliament, but you don't get that cultural change until there are significant numbers of women and people from diverse backgrounds who are actually there changing the culture. And I saw it myself. It was interesting. I was a staffer in 1998, which was the year that a whole lot of Labor women were elected because the quotas had just come in, and there was like literally all of these safe seats were women's seats at that point. So Julia Gillard came in, Penny Wong came in, Tanya Plibersek came in. And I remember being a staffer and literally watching in front of my eyes the culture of the place start to shift because suddenly these women were in caucus and the men actually had to suck up to them and sort of try to get their vote. You see the power shift before your eyes. And I think that the reason why I talk about quotas in such a passionate way is sometimes when there's that much power to be lost, people don't give it up just through the goodness of their own heart. They often need to be forced to give it up. But the benefit of making them forcing them to give it up is truly worth it.
Greg, before we move on, you were wanting to jump in there?
Yeah, so look, I'd make 2 points. First of all, you can over-obsess about how diverse Parliament is in terms of ethnic or gender background. But Sam is just absolutely dead wrong to say parliamentarians are cutting welfare because they don't sympathise with the welfare recipient. Australia's welfare bill is absolutely ballooning. The NDIS now is more expensive than than Medicare and will soon be more expensive than the defence budget. We have an enormous welfare state in this country. The other point I want to make is that much more important than gender quotas, both parties have done a shocking thing in this cycle, both major parties. The Labor Party in Victoria and the Liberal Party in New South Wales have suspended all democratic pre-selections. Now, that is an absolute offence against democracy. I'm less concerned about whether the candidate is male or female or what racial background that they are than that they be democratically elected. And in effect, one of the reasons the two parties are bleeding support so badly to independents and third parties is because their own internal cultures have become so undemocratic. And the Victorian Labor Party hasn't existed as a party now for 2 or 3 years because of this branch stacking scandal. But what that means is it's completely undemocratic. It's democratic centralism. It's as democratic as Kim Jong-un's North Korean Workers' Party. And Scott Morrison did the same thing to the Liberal Party in New South Wales, where he chose 12 of their candidates. And it would be infinitely better if that had been carried out by rank and file plebiscites, who sometimes will choose brilliant people and sometimes will choose terrible people, but at least it's a democratic process.
I do need to jump in on just one thing there, Kath. Greg mentioned that the NDIS is part of the welfare budget, and that is exactly what the sort of thinking that we have to get away from. NDIS is not part of welfare. It's not anything to do with handing out money or any form of charity. It is about giving people with disability the ability to live their lives the way they should. We need to get away with that.
Sam. I don't disagree with that. But transfer payments in this country are almost as great as they would be in any country on planet Earth. And that is not a sign of politicians being niggardly and mean because they lack real life empathy.
And I think we can agree on that. But if perhaps more people in Parliament were recipients of welfare and knew the process, they would know firsthand how the system is inefficient and doesn't work for people. So we can move towards that.
Greg, if I can pick you up on, you mentioned the independents back there just a moment ago, and if we can look at the rise of the Teal candidates, many of these are professional women, doctors, CEOs, who would have been perhaps a more natural fit for the Liberal Party, but they've chosen not to go through the Liberal Party. They're independents for whatever reason that may be. Do you see the Liberal Party responsible at all then for the rise of the Teals?
Yes, but in a way that you're probably not thinking of. One of the most undemocratic elements of our system is the way now parties can manipulate preference flows. I used to be a great supporter of compulsory preferential voting in Australia. I think it now distorts our system. And we saw that most obviously in the Senate, where people were getting elected with 2% of the vote and doing a lot of preference whispering. Now you're getting that virtually in the lower house. And the most egregious example of it really was Adam Bandt's initial election as the member for Melbourne. He got 18% of the vote. Now, the operation of compulsory preferential voting in the lower house now means that a major party candidate can get 45% of the vote and easily be beaten by a Teal independent getting 22 or 23 or 24% of the vote, and then all the other parties, the Labor Party intentionally running dead, but harvesting its preferences, whereas most voters don't really pay attention to their second preferences. They follow the how to vote card. I think that's inherently undemocratic. I think the Teals are undemocratic in other ways too. Their refusal to say who they would back in the event of a minority government is dishonest, it's undemocratic, and it's unfair to voters, because the Teal independents must know by now what the respective policies of the respective parties are, so they should know who they should back.
But when some of them were asked, to be
they are-
fair, when some of them were asked in the past, the costings weren't out yet, and that was the reason that they gave for not giving their preferences.
Well, with respect, Kath, I think that's kind of baloney. If you believe that, I'd like to sell you the Harbour Bridge. I mean, we know very clearly what Anthony Albanese's policies on climate are. We know very clearly what Scott Morrison's are. You can't make a decision by now. That's crazy. But the other thing is, the Teals are essentially populists because they fixate on one issue and they don't make all the sort of compromises which a Westminster system has to make. Like, if you pay for this, you can't pay for that. How are we going to fit it all in the budget? And like many populists, they are funded by a white billionaire. And this is a much less of a grassroots and democratic movement than it seems. I think it rests on a sort of a preference voodoo activity. And I think it's bad for Australia, because if they do hold the balance of power, you'll get even more incoherent, profligate and populist government than we have now.
Verity,
I've got to... Oh, so I was going to say, I've got to agree with Greg. The thinness of the policy agenda of these Teals is just so concerning. To put it, you've talked about costings. None of these Teals have costed their policies. How are they going to reach something like 75% reductions by 2030? If they're worried about costings, when are they going to ask for independent costings of their policies? But going to what Greg was talking about, the business of being an MP is getting the work done in Canberra.
Well,
these aren't people who are going to be able to achieve that. And for the voters of Kooyong and Wentworth, who would never have chosen an ALP candidate, they may find themselves, if they choose a Teal, electing an ALP government.
Well, the Teals are obviously making headlines, as are the leaders for the major parties. And Scott Morrison was... Would you just like to comment there before we move on?
Oh, I just...
That seemed...
I mean, look, it's fine, but I just think the Teals are absolutely coming about because of, firstly, the issues we talked about before around gender and just the... I think it's interesting that a lot of those Teals are women, and they're women that probably should have been Liberal Party candidates but don't feel they have a home in the Liberal Party. And I also think the rise of the Teals is about the incapacity of the Liberal Party to maintain its broad church. Like all major parties, Labor Party included, you win government by having a broad church. And what's been happening in the Liberal Party is that the hard right of the Liberal Party are winning, and there is no part for that moderate, that traditional small L Liberal vote to go anymore. I think that's the reason for the Teals.
OK. Well, I was just going to move on to just something else that we saw Scott Morrison today. I just want to play this clip from a press conference from this morning.
And I know Australians know that I can be a bit of a bulldozer when it comes to issues, and I suspect you guys know that too. As we go into this next period, on the other side of this election, I know there are things that are going to have to change with the way I do things.
Just a really quick take on that, Rashina. I mean, does this show that Scott Morrison is now recognising that perhaps he's not an overly popular candidate?
I think it shows he's somebody who is always going to work harder. So if anyone wants to talk about the Liberals having been in for 9 years and that leading to complacency from incumbency, I think what Scott Morrison is telling us is he is going to fight every day for this country, including looking at himself. And do you know what? It's pretty rare to see politicians have self-reflection. It's something they all struggle with. So I think these remarks show that this is a Prime Minister who is serious about getting the job done for another 3 years. If he needs to change himself, he's willing to do that.
Verity, it was countered by Albanese saying that he's a builder, he's not a bulldozer. And what do you make of the comments?
Oh, I think it makes him sound a bit desperate. Honestly, I was at the beginning of the campaign. Look, he knows that he's got a likeability problem. Everyone understands that. At the beginning of the campaign, I think he ran quite a clever line, which was, "You don't have to like me, but at least I get the job done." Which I thought, oh, that, you know, I can see how that might work. But now he's sort of just deciding that line's obviously not working either. I just promise I'll change, you know. And I think that it's probably the last, you know, desperate appeal.
Well, it may have also just been a throwaway line, and we all might be making a little bit too much of it. Who knows? Well, after 100 years, Bigambul man and elder Uncle Wes has become a repository of stories, history and wisdom. And to commemorate his birthday, the author is releasing a book of poetry reflecting on colonisation, family and Aboriginal dreaming. Through his poems, Uncle Wes invites the reader to join him by the fire as he shares his reflections and reminisces on 100 years of life. He spoke to the ABC's Artworks.
I'm Uncle Wes Mann, the Aboriginal storyteller, and I'm releasing a book of 50 poems to celebrate my 100th birthday. He is the ultimate hunter. He's a bushman without fear, and nothing is safe when he is hunting with his ancient woomer and spear. But what of the one who goes with him? The one who walks in his tracks, usually with one child behind her and another one on her back. I'm a dreamer. I still dream of what I done when I was a young fella, the things that my grandfather taught me. And when they let me into the school, they said, "We're going to let you into the schools, but," 3-letter word, but. You're not allowed to talk about first fleet. Not allowed to talk about a stolen generation. Not allowed to talk about massacres. Not allowed to talk about killings. No, I was allowed to tell Dreamtime stories, but I wasn't allowed to talk about anything else. Well, I was at Redfern Park, all right. Paul Keating was talking, you know what I mean?
We committed the murders. We took the children from their mothers. We practiced discrimination and exclusion.
This poem was about when he said, "Whatever happened to you people?" Indigenous people of this earth land, now's the time for us all to join hands. Let the world know that our culture's alive. Let them all know that we have survived. Let them all know that we're still strong. And let them all know that we are not wrong. While we still sing our songs and still hunt our lands, no one can take our culture from our hands. And they will teach their young ones and teach them what we were told. And we will be here forever. And our culture will never grow old. You know, I wonder that when I go, will I be able to take my stories with me? If I can have these books published, I hope everybody who reads it can get the same pleasure out of it as I had when I wrote it.
Well, you are watching The Drum, and with me on the panel, Pro Vice-Chancellor of Social Justice and Inclusion at the University of Technology, Sydney, and former New South Wales Labor MP Verity Firth. In Melbourne, barrister, City of Melbourne councillor and Liberal Party member Rashina Campbell. Lawyer, disability advocate and former Green staffer Sam Drummond, and foreign editor at The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Well, national security has dominated the headlines again today, with Defence Minister Peter Dutton revealing a Chinese surveillance ship has been tracked off the West Australian coast. Peter Dutton said the vessel has been tracked for a week now and called its proximity to the country's west coast unprecedented.
It's a Chinese warship with an intelligence gathering capability. It's obviously very strange that it's come this far south, and it's hugging the coastline as it goes north. I think it is an aggressive act, and I think particularly because it has come so far south. For it to come south of Exmouth is without precedent.
Well, this announcement came moments after the Foreign Minister Marise Payne and Shadow Minister Penny Wong addressed the National Press Club, with the security of the Pacific region again very much in focus.
A common refrain from leaders from both parties has been Australia doesn't need to choose between the US and China.
We have actually already chosen.
You know, we have an alliance that's over 70 years old.
Embracing the fundamental of the Australia-US alliance is obviously foundational.
The point that we should be focused on is what is the region that we want, with the rules that we want, that enables Australian interests to be advanced and protected.
Australia has no expectations and is not making any indication to any other of our partners or any countries in the region that they would be forced into making choices.
Your government has also lurched from respecting Solomon's sovereignty and saying that we can't throw our weight around, to making comparisons about Cuba and the Prime Minister issuing threats about red lines. So I'd like to understand what is the position.
Well, I don't agree with the premise of all of your question, but
that's what she says in question time too.
But I've only had 6 occasions to be asked a question by Senator Wong on foreign affairs in question time in the last parliamentary term, so I haven't had a chance to say it very often. Across the Pacific, we are the only country in the world which has a diplomatic mission in every country of the Pacific Island Forum.
If you don't do enough in a region, even if you've got the historical ties there or the institutional ties, that vacuum is filled.
Well, Greg, if we can begin with that news about the Chinese ship off the WA coast, just how concerning a development is that?
Look, in itself, it's not that concerning. They're entitled to sail there. We sail all over the place, hoovering up intelligence. I thought that was an extremely good debate at the National Press Club by 2 very impressive women who both had strengths to champion and weaknesses to defend. And one of the government's weaknesses is that Scott Morrison has said a Chinese base in the Solomons would be a red line for Australia, and Marise Payne couldn't tell us what he meant by that, or she wouldn't repeat the same phrase and she wouldn't say whether he consulted her in advance. On the other hand, Penny Wong had to defend what have been some mildly silly statements about China by Richard Marles, and Penny Wong is clearly the most polished and distinguished exponent of strategic issues on her side of politics. I don't think the Chinese ship is anything to lose any sleep over, but it just does show you they're paying a lot of attention, including a lot of military attention. The final point I make is that in my view, it's embarrassing for the government because it shows that we don't have any military capabilities to talk about. I mean, our patrol vessels, which we often use to track these Chinese vessels, although they're as big as a small destroyer, they carry no military weapons. So they could never do any harm to a visiting Chinese ship. Our 8 feeble Anzac frigates are tremendously undermanned and undergunned and would be no match for a modern Chinese warship. We don't have enough planes to keep up the surveillance that we need to, although, of course, we get great radar coverage and great American satellite coverage. And again, in this debate, Penny Wong was criticising the government, not from the left, so to speak, about making too much of defence, but from, so to speak, from the right, saying you haven't delivered defence capabilities. So I think that's mildly embarrassing for the government.
Before we go and unpack the foreign policy discussion at the Press Club today, and before we move on from the ship, speaking to ABC this afternoon, Labor Senator Murray Watt said that, and I quote, he hopes we don't have a government that misuses security information for political advantage, adding he wasn't alleging that. I mean, is the timing of the announcement a consideration at all, given that they'd been surveilling this ship for a week?
Yeah, look, that's a perfectly legitimate question. I'm not too much a polypure heart about this. I think both sides will conduct a pretty vigorous political debate. Where I think the government has occasionally gone wrong is they've exaggerated the rhetoric. I think it's foolish to talk about war with China. I think that's very foolish. That's much more foolish than it is to reveal that a Chinese ship is off our coast, because a Chinese ship really is there. And Dutton today was perfectly sober in the statements that he made about it. Similarly, I think this red line rhetoric was wrong. At the same time, I think some of the things that Richard Marles said in that book, which was published as recently as last August, where he made silly party political points. He said, how stupid is it for the government to be hyper concerned about non-existent Chinese bases in the South Pacific? Well, we are very concerned that all of our security agencies, and indeed the Labor Party, is very concerned about the potential for a Chinese military base in the South Pacific. But that kind of stuff, I think, is a misjudgment on both sides. Overall, we have a pretty mature strategic debate in Australia. And as I say, I think Penny Wong and Maurice Payne are very distinguished exponents of it today.
Do you think, though, it's right to almost call it, I mean, a debate? They were facing off against one another. But when you look at what they were saying and you would look at how they approach the South Pacific region and look at how they approach how they would deal with China, was there any real discerning differences in policies between the two of them that they outlined today?
Not much. Not much, but that's no bad thing. You see, it's wrong. It's a very bad thing in our culture if we say the only interesting political discussion is one where Labor and Liberal are screaming at each other, hurling insults, and have absolutely contradictory policies. A mature, stable, democratic nation has a certain bedrock of bipartisanism on basic security issues. So Penny Wong said, a Labor government won't take a step backwards in the China relationship in terms of defending Australia's national interest. She also said, do you choose between China and the United States? She said, we've already chosen. We've got a military alliance with the United States, 70 years strong, and we're very worried about China. Now, Maurice Payne said all the same things in different ways. So they argue with each other over competence in delivering these policies, and they have some policy differences. Labor would give more aid to the South Pacific and so forth, and change the South Pacific Labor scheme. But it's no bad thing. That's not a lack of democracy. That's not a lack of alternative. That is government and opposition both recognising the core national interest and prosecuting that. And as a citizen, I'm glad that they both do that.
Sam, would you endorse this bipartisan approach with foreign policy, or would you like to see something different?
I do like it when I agree with Greg on some things, but it does look like Labor and Liberal are lockstep on the American alliance. I do think there is a conversation about, a nuanced conversation about the value of that and what we can take out of it, because we are relying on America to uphold their end of that deal. The thing that's happened in recent times is that we've had successive cuts to DFAT and diplomats. We have had major cuts to foreign aid, including in the Pacific, and we've had bipartisan failure on climate change. We have failed to recognise how important that is for some of our Pacific neighbours, and we've seen that in the reaction of the Solomon Islands. Now, yesterday, the first High Commissioner of the Solomon Islands went up to Scott Morrison and said, "You've lost my vote." Things like that show how we've failed in what we've seen as very small players, but now that the geographic power has shifted to our area of the world, and we are well and truly into the Asian century, we're seeing the failure of in a policy sense come back to bite us in that sense.
Rashina?
I'm going to have to disagree with Greg and Sam about the ALP being strong on the Chinese Communist Party, because I think any voter that relied on Penny Wong's words today would be seriously misled if they didn't also take into account the very recent actions of the ALP. I'm thinking about the fact that Richard Marles went to visit senior Chinese officials 10 times after China leaked to our media a list of 14 demands, the things Australia needed to change if we were to have a close relationship with China. And people talk about that list of 14 demands. They were serious demands. They were things like not having freedom of press, no longer criticising the Chinese Communist Party over Taiwan and Hong Kong. After the Chinese Communist Party gave us that list, for Richard Marles to continue to meet with Chinese officials, that's concerning. As concerning is him sharing a copy of his speech with the Chinese embassy before delivering it to them. The closeness of that relationship should be determined by the actions of senior people in the ALP like Richard Marles, not just the words of Penny Wong saying we've made the choice on China. And when it comes to this,
just your response on that from a Labor perspective, and is Labor going soft on China? Is Rashina's points valid?
No, I mean, I agree with what Greg was saying. I think that probably the biggest thing that we noticed today out of the Foreign Minister's debate was that there wasn't a great lot of difference. in the fundamentals of what is it that were in Australia's interests, the strong relationship with the US and a recognition, an increasing recognition of the complexity of modern geopolitics and that we actually have to step pretty carefully and pretty conservatively in some ways around how we actually deal with some of these issues. Having said that, I do agree with Sam. I'm hoping either whoever, Liberal or Labor, gets in, that we do actually start to have more of a leadership position on issues of climate change globally. I think there's a really important role that Australia can play as a middling power, utilising multilateral forums like the UN, where we actually can do some pretty useful and impactful global influence. And I think climate change in particular, it's embarrassing that Australia has one of the weakest 2030 targets in the world. It's embarrassing that we're sort of grouped together with Russia and Saudi Arabia in terms of our position on these things. And I think that that's where there could be a more ambitious foreign policy.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, Greg, there's sort of two attack lines, if you like, that each is going after each other on. The Labor Party is saying that, you know, the coalition has mismanaged relationships in the Pacific and China, and then the coalition is saying Labor is soft on China. I mean, is there truth to either of these? What do you say to the voter when they're hearing these kind of two main lines that are being thrown out there? We might have lost you there, Greg. I'm sure he had something fabulous to say.
Just while we're getting Greg back, can I just comment on Verity's point about needing to improve 2030 targets to be some sort of climate change leader? It clearly wasn't a problem for the Solomon Islands, or they wouldn't have signed an agreement with an emitter like China. Climate change clearly was not on their agenda, something that they were having regard to. But we need to be frank about what happened there. In the lead up to a challenge to the government there was a no confidence motion. That failed. Every MP who voted against it received a $40,000 payment from the Prime Minister, funded by the Chinese Communist Party. Now, these aren't new revelations. We've known about them for a while, but nobody wants to talk about them. And when we talk about Australia and the government having done something different in the Solomon Islands, when the ALP says we should have done something else, what would that have been?
Well, there
Going
you
to
go,
some sort of Rolex bidding war.
It's over to you. I mean, what would you have liked to have seen the Labor Party to do? Exactly what it has done, or were there something else?
I mean, I think the problem with the Solomon Islands is that there's been a declining relationship. Australia's role in the Pacific Island region has been declining over the last decade or so. Some of it has been around the big cuts to aid, including big cuts to Solomon Islands aid. And I disagree. I think that there's a big difference between, I actually think laughing at the fact that there is an existential crisis for some of these Pacific Island nations. That was captured, right? Like, they know what we feel. Plus, as Sam was saying, this lack of expenditure around some of the traditional arts of diplomacy. There just doesn't seem to have been a respectful relationship of equals happening in the last decade in terms of our relationship with the Pacific.
Okay. Well, it is, of course, hard to miss that there's an election on between the billboards, corflutes and the barrage of TV and digital ads. We're all being bombarded by an election ad spending spree. And in some cases, the minor parties are outspending them all. Since August last year, the United Australia Party alone has spent an astonishing $40 million on advertising. And Clive Palmer's party is just one of several minor parties spending up big to leave an impression on the electorate. The Drum's David Taylor has more.
Queensland. Beautiful one day, election cornerstone the next.
G'day, I'm Campbell Newman and I'm your Queensland Senate candidate for the Liberal Democrats.
Domestic violence, $1 trillion of debt, broken families.
But there's still hope. When you elected me, we used the balance of power to get $13 billion for renewables and a ton of new jobs.
Most of the money coming from the minor parties is being spent in the Senate contest, and it's being spent to target that final Senate seat in Queensland.
Look, I'm very proud to be the leader of One Nation.
One Nation founder Pauline Hanson and former Queensland LNP Premier Campbell Newman are both in contention, as is mining magnate Clive Palmer, whose best chance of electoral success is in Queensland.
The United Australia Party is the only party standing in every seat in the House of Representatives.
Well, the first thing is...
While TV and radio advertising has long been recognised for having broad reach, it's online, analysts say, that may provide the parties with the biggest bang for the advertising buck.
Happy Easter, everyone.
Well, I think in Queensland, for that final Senate spot, it's going to be Facebook. It's assumed that that final Senate seat will be a contest between the right-wing minor parties, and they will be really trying to seek the votes of those in the outer metropolitan and regional areas. The amount of money being spent, in particular by the UAP and Clive Palmer, is it's just astronomical. Not just across Facebook, but across Google, across YouTube. He's spending millions of dollars, which is not unexpected, but we're also seeing a whole range of other candidates spending really significant amounts of money each week and each month on the digital campaign.
So, does any of it work or cut through to influence decisions on polling day? According to ABC election analyst Anthony Green, while the United Australia Party's preference flows didn't significantly affect any results in 2019, its anti-Labor message did have an impact.
Well, for more on this, we're joined by Professor of Digital Communication at the Queensland University of Technology, Daniel Angus, who has been looking closely at digital ad spends in this election. Danny, thank you for joining us.
No worries, thank you.
Now, a lot of that story focused on the digital media spend, the marketing digital spend there. Just how targeted can these ads be, and of what benefit are they?
So targeted advertising online, as mentioned in that article, happens through the major platforms. So we're talking within things like YouTube, Google News, on Meta's platforms like Instagram and Facebook. And they have the ability, advertisers have the ability, in fact, to target down to postcode levels and also do what they call lookalike audiences, where it can target based on interest categories. So say caravanning or some other kind of interest category. And these can reach, very, very small audiences and for very small amounts of money.
And probably caravanners who like to fish, it could be that, specific as well, I'm sure. How have you seen these ads being used over the last 5 weeks, particularly when you look at the speed with which they can target people?
Absolutely, and speed is really critical because digital advertising can be spooled up in a matter of minutes, whereas those traditional forms of advertising like billboards, newspaper, television ads can take days to kind of get and gear up into a campaign. And we've seen them kind of be used in that responsive way. So after, say, early gaffes in the campaign, there were ads already circulating within moments, kind of trying to play on that and try and drive a wedge there. But we have to also consider that this online advertising is not necessarily about directly changing and swinging votes. It can be just around setting agendas. So getting people talking about things and setting agendas also in the media itself.
Yeah, it's interesting on that setting agenda idea, because when you've got this hyper-local targeting, isn't it then difficult to track all the individual messages?
Absolutely, and it's something that is I guess a fact of our modern media environment now, is that it's incredibly fractured, and so we know that people aren't necessarily, particularly young people, aren't going to traditional news sources as a single source of news. They're using a variety of sources, and a lot of them include social media, and so they're encountering not just the sponsored content but organic content within those platforms, and it's incredibly difficult for us to have observability around the kinds of ads and other content they're consuming, and so yeah, it's very difficult to know the ebb and flow of a campaign.
So is there enough oversight then to ensure that there's not mis or disinformation proliferating out there?
So with sustained pressure, news organisations, civil society and indeed academics have been heaping onto the platforms. They've started to open up some of these transparency tools. So the major platforms have ad transparency initiatives that log the political ads that are declared as political, but it still doesn't necessarily provide oversight and transparency into, say, what we call dark ads, so ads that might not be properly disclosed. And we have seen a couple of those already in this campaign. But more than that, those tools don't necessarily go far enough to kind of reveal down to that detailed targeting level. So Facebook, as one case, for example, can tell you this ad was played in Queensland, but it won't tell you if it was played in Brisbane or, say, in Gladstone. And that's a really critical missing piece of information, because we know that messages by single parties might try and tailor their message, and it might be actually a conflicting message between, say, a regional and urban audience. And if we can't see that, we can't hold them to account.
Greg, what role do you think think the AEC has to play in this? I mean, how can they possibly stay on top of the political messaging when you look at just how targeted it is?
So, Kath, can I have tremendous indulgence just to say, I don't think Labor is going soft on China. I think Miles has said a few silly things, but I don't for a single second doubt his patriotism or his commitment to national security. And I do think it is a failure of Australian policy, this Solomon Islands China agreement. Now, on the AEC, that's so kind of you to indulge me. I'm really grateful. Look, on the AEC, I think there is a big civilisational challenge, which we're only beginning to grapple with. How do we bring social media and the internet under the rule of law? That is to say, not to try to censor it, but to bring it within the rule of law so that it has to abide by rules about incitement to violence and hatred and defamation and all the rest of it, but also so that in very strict things, it doesn't tell lies. Now, it's not a lie for Labor to say inflation will be worse under the Liberals, or for the Liberals to say taxes will be higher under Labor. That's not a lie. That's okay. It might be rubbish, but that's okay. But if somebody says to you, you know, candidate X was charged with a pedophile offence, and that's not true, well, then, you know, we need to have some redress about that. But at the moment, it is so superbly and minutely targeted, and these algorithms are designed not only to appeal to your interests, but to appeal to things that make you angry. And often the things that make you angry aren't true. Now, this is an ongoing battle. It's not, we're only in the infancy of this, but getting a balance between regulation but maintaining freedom is going to be a very big challenge for our civilisation.
And a very long challenge to get to some sort of outcome, you would imagine, given what's played out already. Sam, I want to ask you, it seems as though, you know, if you listen to what we've just been speaking to Daniel about and the package, that the minor parties are really benefiting from this type of advertising. It is a lot cheaper, it is a lot more targeted. Do you think that that's a good thing for the minor parties?
Certainly the parties are doing different things. I know the Greens are targeting different social media platforms that are used by young people, and they're employing a lot of young people to do that messaging. We can't underestimate the $40 million curveball or the chaos ball that Clive Palmer is throwing into this. Last election, everyone was wondering, what's he trying to achieve? And we saw what he was trying to achieve at the end, and that was an anti-Labor campaign. We don't really know what's happening here. There's not so much anti-Labor campaigning happening from the UAP, but maybe that will ramp up in the next week. Certainly one thing that is destructive is right now I can drive through the suburbs of Melbourne and see great big Clive Palmer billboards talking about populist policies around mortgage rate caps, which may or may never happen, probably won't. We don't know what's being said in these murky waters of the internet. And for me, that's the danger to democracy right now.
Daniel, Sam brings up the point, that $40 million spend by Clive Palmer. I mean, there is a huge amount of money that is washing around. You've had a look at some of those electorates.
Yeah, so there's some key electorates where that spend is significantly high, and certainly you've mentioned already the Senate race in Queensland. That's an area where there's been significant spend. But yeah, the amount of money that's been pumped in by UAP dwarfs all of the other parties, even the major parties, in terms of its just sheer scale of spend in the digital arena as well. But yeah, when we go down to single seats, so Kooyong's a great example of this. We're seeing people like Josh Frydenberg has spent in the last 30 days or so upwards of around $80,000 on advertising from his own personal Facebook page. In comparison to the Teal Independent, Dr. Monique Ryan, who spent about $50,000 on Facebook advertising. So yeah, we're seeing some very significant spends in comparison to other electoral contests that we've tracked and studied. But I just want to come back also on this issue of the need for transparency. So we mentioned AEC, who are very much in charge of looking at our elections and making sure they're run in a free and fair manner. There are other organisations as well, government organisations, that need this kind of transparency around what's happening online. And I think we're missing a trick here when it comes to the infrastructure required for all of these government departments, and indeed us as academics, to track and study this. It just doesn't exist.
So if that did exist and did happen, then would it make it easier or more amenable for it to be regulated?
I think so, absolutely. So I think we need a national level infrastructure that can be used by the regulators in whatever form. So, I mean, you think about our various regulators, even around things like, say, problematic health content, so health regulators, those involved in the regulation of substances such as alcohol, tobacco, they all need insight into what's happening in that ad space. But at the moment, there's no real kind of coordination. I mean, we as academics and some journalists write and develop these dashboards to try and do a little bit of this tracking, but we're limited in our resource of what we can achieve. And I think we do, to Greg's point, need a much more concerted national level campaign around this of how do we actually build the tools we need to kind of look back at the platforms themselves.
Yeah, Greg, even if the infrastructure is there to track it and then to potentially look at some sort of regulatory framework, is there an appetite there to do so? Because it's up to the governments to make it happen, is it not?
I think there is an increasing appetite to do so, and different jurisdictions are looking for greater legal oversight of the net. But you also have the danger of swinging too far the other way and just censoring people and views that you don't like. But I think the problem is not so much the lack of will at the moment, just the tremendous technical challenge to be able to do it effectively.
All right, well, fascinating topic, and Daniel, we really appreciate your feedback. Daniel Angus is a professor at the School of Communication at QUT. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Well, Dunghutti artist Black Douglas has taken out the coveted Archibald Prize for his portrait of Wiradjuri artist Carla Dickens. The work, titled Moby Dickens, reflects on the devastating impact of the Northern Rivers flood seen in February and March. Black Douglas is the second Indigenous artist to win the prize in its 101-year history. Jude Ray's portrait of inventor Saul Griffith was highly commended, and last week Klaus Stangley was announced as the winner of the Archibald Packing Room Prize for his portrait of New Zealand actor and director Taika Waititi. Greg, what do you think it is about the Archibalds that captures the imagination of so many of us?
Well, I think, it's said that the true subject of human literature are the truths of the human heart. And I think the most elevated subject for a painter or an artist is a human being. I mean, my favourite gallery in the world is the National Portrait Gallery in London. Human beings and human faces, what is that wonderful poem, such is the beauty of an aged face, I just can't call it to mind, but the human face is kind of inexhaustible. And, my late colleague and beloved friend, Bill Leake, he painted for the Archibald every year. We love the Archibald. I don't think he ever won a prize. I don't think his paintings were often made it into the main exhibit, but he had something that he could bring out something in the human face. And his portraits of Don Bradman and of Les Patterson, there's just, you feel that you know these figures more for having seen the portrait than if you hadn't seen it.
Yeah, there's a real intimacy with it, isn't there? And Sam, I know your favourite was the 2009 portrait of Dr. Gurumul Yunupingu by Guy Maestri, who's one of my favourite artists. I mean, why did this stand out for you? It's quite a haunting image.
It is. That one captured that moment where I think Australia started to recognise him as one of the great Australian musicians, and saw him at the peak of his powers as a musician, but also so vulnerable as well. And I think, to Greg's point, that is one of the things where we see in portraits that it shows us at our most vulnerable as well. And I really appreciated that. I also appreciated Benjamin Law's pick that was entered in this year, where he was at his most vulnerable, and I had to shout out, Ben, your bottom's showing.
That theme of vulnerability, I think, is what appeals to so many people in portraits. And I think it was 2016 when the portrait of Barry Humphries won. one. And that was just a masterpiece, to paint a man that had so many facets and have to distill it down to one, and in doing that capture that vulnerability. I think that just goes to the strength that our artists have in being able to see into someone's soul.
Did you see vulnerability in your pick, which was the 2000 portrait of David Wenham?
I saw the essence of a scruffy David Wenham, and I think it's funny because I was trying to work out why did I like it so much, and I almost couldn't pinpoint it. I love the beard. It's what Greg was saying, actually, that it's almost like a photo doesn't reveal what that painting reveals about the essence of the man. And interestingly, because I knew you were going to ask me, we all knew you were going to ask about the Archibald, I was looking at all of the Archibalds today online, and the portraits themselves are a history of Australia. So it's a history of the people of the era, and you can see who was important at the time, but it's a history of art as well. You watch the way that art is done throughout the eras and the changing methods and the changing
and you look at the difference between the Packing Room Prize to the winner. They're very different styles of art.
Yeah, I know. And I also agree with Greg as well. I'm agreeing with you as well, Greg, today. There is something particularly magical about portraiture, and I similarly can look at a portrait for ages and ages, and I love the way that it makes you think about what was this person's life, what were their hopes,
so that's an interesting question, isn't it? Sam, I might put this one to you. You know, is art, when you consume it, about how it makes you feel or the conversation it might start?
It's both, right? I can go through a gallery by myself and contemplate the meaning behind each piece. But it's similarly a terrific experience to go with a group, go out for dinner afterwards, and then just talk about what was the artist thinking with this.
Of workers in our society going backwards, those higher interest rates could really hurt their spending. And we're starting to see that in consumer confidence, which is soft. So I think a lift in minimum wages in order to keep real wages stable is critical to that process of normalising interest rates without risking a recession.
Of course, critics say, though, that there's a risk of a price spiral if we do start to see that. What do you say to those critics?
Well, two things. One is the process of raising interest rates will deal with that excess demand for labour in the economy over the next few years. Secondly, beyond the Fair Work Commission's decision, I think you'll see that wages are starting to head towards 4 to 5% in the broader economy anyway. And finally, the Fair Work Commission's decision is for 1 year only. And a wage price spiral is all about entrenching inflation expectations within the private sector, I might add, and being an ongoing problem. The Fair Work Commission can quite easily follow up next year with a much more modest increase in the minimum wage, which I would expect them to do. This is really a one-off reset after a couple of years where inflation's come in much higher than anyone expected, and the minimum wage has not been able to keep pace.
Of course, if we do see, a 4 or 5% increase in wages, that's going to hurt some employers. What's the solution for those businesses?
It's really, really tough for SMEs at the moment, and I speak to them all the time. And there is no skirting around this. They're having to deal with higher costs, and wages are going to be part of that story. So I think the Fair Work Commission decision needs to reflect what I think is happening more broadly in the economy, and businesses have to respond to that. They have to respond to that, importantly, by trying to invest in labour-saving technologies, whether that's new plant and equipment, digitisation, whatever the option is for a particular business. Beyond that, if we start to see genuine and undesirable stress emerge, the government has other policy tools, whether that be within the labour market, some further reform of labour markets for particularly smaller employers, or they could even temporarily cut income taxes for small business. I mean, there are other ways to address it. I just don't think that keeping real wages in decline is the healthy and appropriate approach to the economic challenges we've got. And if we do see the stresses emerge in the SME sector, then there's other policy tools we can employ.
Of course, next week we will get the numbers on wages that we've been waiting for and the latest monthly labour force data. What do you expect they'll tell us?
Well, the wages should show a further acceleration from last year, but they'll still be low. I doubt we'll see annual wage growth much above 2.5 to 2 3/4. And that's because these figures measure the whole labour force, and the labour force is only going to be repriced, for lack of a better word, i.e. everyone get a wage review in these new circumstances over a period of time. I mean, theoretically, some people have to wait 3 years with an EBA. So I don't expect to see the wage pressures that we're currently observing in the economy show up in these numbers for at least another year. And we know they're there anecdotally, as well as through things like the NAB business survey. So they're coming through, but I don't think we'll see them next week. The employment report will be critical, as it always is. I suspect we'll see another reasonable number, and I think there's a very good chance we'll officially have an unemployment rate with a 3 in front of it. And of course, that really just highlights that this is the right environment to do these wage adjustments. You know, it's a much harder ask when unemployment is high or higher than full employment. But when full employment has been achieved, now is the time to do these adjustments to wages.
Warren Hogan, great to have your analysis. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Mortgages are heading higher, and that's spooking households. The latest read on consumer confidence shows it tumbled 5.6% on fears of further rate rises. That's the biggest drop since June 2015, sending it to its lowest level since Victoria was grappling with its second wave COVID lockdown in August last year. This month, it's the prospect of a higher cost of living and rising mortgage rates that have knocked families' faith in their spending power. The crypto market has been shattered this week. One coin, Luna, is down almost 100%. It was meant to be one of the good ones. Cryptos have been on the slide for a while. Here's a look at Bitcoin, down 56% over the past 6 months, largely because of falling confidence the tech sector will continue to outperform. Rising rates are also offering more enticing places for cash. However, what's happened this week is completely different. The collapse in Luna and the huge falls it set off for other coins was the result of a massive and opportunistic trade. Let's take a look at that fall. In Thursday trading, Luna was almost wiped out, with trade suspended on Friday. The trade was apparently carried out by one hedge fund, exploiting a weakness in the crypto market to make off like a bandit. Elise Morgan asked Lisa Wade, CEO with Digital X, why Luna crashed.
So Luna has crashed because it's attached to a stable coin called UST, and basically as the stable coin UST gets sold off, more Luna gets minted, and so it has crashed because the stable coin was part of a trade and has disconnected from its peg.
So what is a stable coin? Because that name seems fairly ironic now, given what we've seen.
A stablecoin, in essence, is what we call an on-ramp into crypto. So it's a token that represents one Australian, or in this case, US dollar, and people use them as savings pools and a way to be in Web 3.0, but not own actual cryptos.
What exactly was the mechanics of it? What actually happened in this trade? They bought a huge amount of this stablecoin. Then what happens? What did they do? How did they make money, and why did it make Luna crash?
So yes, the first step was to buy the UST. They waited till a Saturday night when the volumes were very low and there were no bids, and then they went into a trading pool and started selling UST in massive volumes, which then triggered all of the subsequent selling in a low volume market. That broke the peg. The selling starts to feed on itself from the mechanics of the algorithm. Luna was impacted because Luna is the underlying of the UST, and it's linked in a way that every time a UST is bought, a Luna is burnt. That means there's less tokens in supply, so the Luna price goes up. The reverse applies when people start selling. So every time someone sells a UST, they mint a Luna, which means there's more volume, and if there's no buyers, then the price goes down. Then it starts to feed on itself because people start panicking and selling Luna. And I mean, what we have seen is nothing short of carnage. It's quite horrible to watch.
Despite global markets still struggling with looming rate hikes, inflation and war, the ASX bucked the lead from Wall Street and added 2% on Friday. But it wasn't enough to undo the damage throughout the week. The top 200 ended the 5 days of trading down 1.8%, while the broader All Ordinaries wiped off 2.1%. Hebe Chen from IG Markets confirms it was a horror week for cryptocurrencies.
So cryptocurrencies definitely has experienced quite a wild week this week, especially for the Thursday. We have seen the Bitcoin price that dropped about 10% overnight. The second largest cryptocurrency, Ethereum, has dropped over 18% just in one day. Well, the simple answer for why there's a big substantial drop is because the massive selling pressure or selling off from the investors, that investors tend to kind of rush into get rid of the coins in their hand. And if talking about what's the sentiment driven that move is, I think mainly it's because the uncertainty and the fears about the future that people tending to taking a more of the risk-off strategy for the highly risk asset class like cryptocurrency.
Australian stocks rose on Friday, but on Thursday they touched a 3-month low.
Yes, that's right. Australian stock market has been going through about 4 straight days of loss from Monday to Thursday, even though we have seen about 2% up for the Friday. But overall, if you're looking for the weekly pictures, we're still sitting in the 6th straight week of decline. While the downtrend for the Australian markets, I think there's coming 2 factors is having driven the downtrend. The first one, the major one, is more probably tracking the U.S. stocks. As we know that U.S. stocks, 3 major indices like S&P 500, Dow Jones, and the Nasdaq all touched their 52 weeks low this week. And in terms of region, like the Australian market in particular, the other reason is because the China that has been upgraded their lockdown and while downgrading the economy outlook, which has been impacting for the economy, like the future for the whole APEC regions. And both of factors has been driving, I think, the more of a lower sentiment or pessimistic sentiments in the market for Australian shares.
And Hebe, how did the dollar perform this week amidst all of this volatility?
Yeah, the Australian dollar is falling below the 70 cents. While compared to just 4 weeks ago, it's roughly about 75 cents. There's a big drop for the past couple of weeks. The pressure on the Australian currency is mainly coming from the strength of the USD dollars because people are pushing or trading for a safe havens for the investment. On the other side, the global economy outlook has been tending to put more pressures for the commodity currencies like Australian dollars.
Hebe Chen, so great to have you on the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you.
Politicians of all colours have been handing out the cash and promises. As interest rates rise, Clive Palmer's United Australia Party is pledging to guarantee a cap on mortgage rates. While it sounds like a vote winner, experts say it could undermine the Australian dollar and destabilise the financial system, as Michael Yander explains.
Interest rates are rising and mortgage repayments are set to soar, so this might sound like a good idea.
We'll pass a law limiting all home loan interest rates to be below 3% for the next 5 years to save your home and Australia's way of life.
But is this even possible? Former Reserve Bank economist Zach Gross says there are a few ways it could be done.
The first is just to have taxpayers fund the difference between what the banks are charging and that 3% upper limit, but that would be very expensive to the federal budget.
If you want to do it for 2%, that's $26 billion, and you want to do it for 5 years, well, you're getting well above $100 billion.
Liberal and Labor have racked up a $1 trillion debt. This will trigger interest.
For a party campaigning against the nation's soaring debt levels, this doesn't seem to add up.
I think we can legislate to limit home loans, because if you look back in the 60s and the 70s, that's how the interest rates operated in this country.
An economic grind in which crippling mortgage repayments have gobbled up a bigger and bigger share of the family income.
Former Reserve Bank board member John Edwards bought his first home in that era and says things didn't work too well back then.
Well, first of all, you'd beg some of it from a bank, and reluctantly they'd give you some. But you had to get more to actually buy a house, and often a real estate agent would say, look, we can get the rest of this money from a lawyer's office, but it'd be a higher rate and a shorter term.
Zach Gross says it probably wouldn't work any better now.
If you force banks to make a loss on the mortgages that they issue, well, then they're going to stop issuing mortgages.
There is a third way to lower mortgage costs. UAP leader Craig Kelly says the government could raise money by selling Treasury bonds at very low interest rates and on lending that cheap cash to retail banks. The problem is the current bond rate is already above 3% and no investors would take a lower return. Another option would be for the Reserve Bank to issue cheap loans, as it did during the pandemic. But the government would probably need to use the Reserve Bank Act to order the central bank to adopt this policy. This has never happened, and there's a good reason why. Before the government gave the Reserve Bank full independence in the early 1990s, inflation frequently got out of control.
So there's no free lunch to be had here. We could force the RBA to issue more funding to banks in order to lower mortgages, but it would come at the cost of higher inflation and be quite costly to the rest of Australia.
Zach Gross says it could undermine the Australian dollar and threaten the whole financial system.
I'd say there's a small probability of hyperinflation, but if you wanted to go about causing it, this is exactly what you would do to do so.
There's one final thorn in Clive Palmer's plan for a 3% mortgage cap.
There would be a very small outside chance that you could get up in Queensland where he's the lead candidate, but other than that, the UAP has no realistic chance of winning a seat anyway.
That means there'd be absolutely no pressure on the next government to back any UAP policies.
Housing affordability has been another hot button issue. Most party promises focus on helping voters buy homes, yet little is on offer for the 8 million Australians who rent. Experts say more properties need to be built, and Australia is well behind similar economies when it comes to providing social housing. Daniel Ziffer reports.
Amanda knows how important it is to have a home.
When I was pregnant, I was homeless again.
A third of Australians rent where they live. But Amanda doesn't have confidence election promises will help her.
It seems like a bit of a quick fix or a band-aid to say, yes, we are going to help by this policy. And home ownership is, going to be affordable because of this, but it can't be fixed that quickly.
The focus of major parties has been getting more people into home ownership.
The home guarantee scheme. And that means that you're not saving for a deposit of some 20%.
A Labor government will create a new Help to Buy program, a national shared equity scheme.
But rental vacancy rates are at record lows.
Rents are going to go one way, and that's higher because there's just this real lack of supply and there's a lot of people demanding rental accommodation.
People are also renting for longer.
We always seem to talk about the price of housing for people who are buying it, and I think we do have a historical hangover in Australia where we think of people in the private rental market. We think of that as a transitionary stage in people's housing journey.
Nationwide, median rents have jumped almost 5% year on year. In regional areas, it's more than 10%. The squeeze is on. After a decade of stagnant wage growth, interest rates are rising again as the Reserve Bank tries to battle soaring inflation that's eroding people's purchasing power. This is being described as an election focused on the cost of living. And the biggest cost of living for households is housing.
Look, the big issue over a long period of time in the housing market is that we haven't seen the investment into low-cost rental accommodation that we need.
That might be turning around. Both the Coalition and Labor have committed to building nearly 30,000 units of social housing, where rents are capped. But researchers say we need 400,000 more. And we're well behind nations with similar economies, where affordable homes are provided by the government.
We actually didn't have a supply of housing, including rental product, that we needed coming into the pandemic.
Whether you want to rent or buy, the housing industry is concerned not enough properties are being built. The annual shortfall set to balloon to 20,000 homes within a decade.
What we need is national action on housing supply, national action to address housing affordability. We've got the models, we just need the will.
Boundless plains and not enough houses on them. In the western suburbs of Melbourne, builders are dealing with skyrocketing prices for materials.
Across the building industry, I'd say it's 20 to 30% cost increase in the last year alone, and we don't know where the bottom is.
Finding staff is also a problem. That's adding to inflation.
The bigger issue is there's only a finite amount of a trade base, and we've got an increased demand. All the builders are in the same boat.
Meaning no easy answers for a growing group of 8 million renters looking to put a roof over their heads.
I want for me and my child is, you know, a stable house that I can call my own, and I can paint the walls and I can do, you know, what I want to that's secure and mine.
A basic human need, yet still very much a promise.
And that's all from Close of Business. For more